Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something very, very real. Like your grandma would probably faint real. We're asking, what was sex really like in medieval times? So, before you get too comfortable, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, and let's jump in. Now, let me warn you, this ain't your grandma's romance novel. I'm talking smells, sounds, surprise, fertility rites, and yes, plenty of awkward moments. But hey, if you're here for awkward, smash that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments your wildest medieval misconception. Ready? Buckle up. You wake up in a crowded village, hall no curtains, no privacy. The smell of last night's stew mingles with other smells. Think sweaty animals, unwashed bodies, fermented beer spilled on straw. You try to roll over, but oops, you're shoulder to shoulder with your cousin and 3 other people you barely know. Sound cozy, and this was normal. Privacy was rare like Wi-Fi in 1200 AD rare, but people still did the thing. So, how'd they manage? First off, imagine a medieval bedroom if you can call one single room for 6 people a bedroom. Curtains made of cloth scraps were status symbols. Most had no such luxury. So, yes, if you wanted to get frisky, your audience might be your neighbor's kid or your pet pig. You try whispering sweet nothings when everyone can hear you. Hey, be quiet, or I'll, doesn't quite work. Comment below. Would you take that over modern Airbnb sharing? I mean camming with your cousins. Yikes. Nobility had more privacy than peasants, but also more expectations. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about land, power, and alliances. Love letters existed, but those were for outside the castle walls. Picture a high-born lady walking down to the chapel, praying she loved this dude she's never met. He probably has questionable dental hygiene. Romance. Modern mystery date costs $10. Medieval marriage could cost your family your livelihood. How's that for romance? Let's talk rules. Today's compliance checklist gets complicated. Medieval church compliance. A nightmare. Clergy preached chastity like it was the hottest trend. No sex before marriage. No extramarital. No, basically, all the fun. But like any trend, it had a rebel cause. People still did the thing, just off book or in secret. But if you got caught, fines, public shaming, or worse, that public shame was called the pillory. Not as fun as it sounds. Public humiliation, 90% more effective than unsubscribing from spam emails. Marriage means kids, lots of them. Childbearing was basically your job description, and you might do it 8 to 12 times before menopause. You try keeping up with that. Today, my knees hurt just thinking about it. And births were medieval. No epidurals, no sterile rooms, just a witch, a midwife, and maybe your mother squawking about how you need to breathe properly. Fun fact, women had pain relief rituals, chants, maybe a stiff drink, because nothing says ancient anesthesia like swig this nettle brew and grit your teeth. Did they die? Sometimes. Infection was the preeminent villain. Forget horror movies if you survived childbirth. That was the real ending credit. Romans had their funny talk for private parts. Medievalers, they weren't any more PG-13. Words like pudendum made people blush but also giggle. Bathroom humor exists for a reason. Imagine husband and wife tossing sheep bones into a basket to signal bedtime. Or wives smearing sheep fat under the door so the dog wouldn't sneeze. extra privacy, kinda. Earplugs were a thing, because if the walls could talk, well, you get the idea. Consent back then. It wasn't modern consent, no 18-point checklist, but courtship customs existed, dances, gifts, reputation mattered. Imagine a medieval Tinder. You present yourself at the village fair, give a token, and walk away with hopes in your pocket. But reputation was everything. If you skipped the line, your family name got dragged in the dirt. Scandal worse than getting ghosted. Stories usually gloss over queer medieval folks, but they existed. And they found ways to love, sometimes in secret, sometimes in the light of candlelit niches. So, sex in medieval times wasn't binary. Love was messy, varied, and very human. It wasn't Netflix and chill, but it was people being people. Let's talk birth control, or the way medievalers did it. Rooftop ideas, that is, herbal poultices, amulets, magical chants. They tried it all. But only condoms. No, not like ours. They used animal intestines. Yeah, your head just went there. Oh, and if that didn't work, guess what? Abortion existed, but dangerous and illegal. The punishments for it, harsh, like no Netflix binge, harsh. So, was medieval sex good? Well, in one way or another, sure, people had sex. They conceived, they laughed, they lived. But the world around them was brutal. Sanitation, minimal. Medicine, medieval at best. Fast forward to today. We have privacy, family planning, consent, education, antibiotics, and yes, that's a glop. So here's the question. Asterisk, what part of medieval sex are you kind of grateful to live without? Comment below. We might just feature your funniest answer in the next video. Host, alright, time to dim the candle, but not your curiosity. Medieval sex was raw, real, human, and it reminds us how far we've come, but also how universal our desires, our fears, and our need for connection really are. Today, we have safety, science, and choice. But tonight, when you're alone or with someone you trust, maybe remember that the thread connecting you stretches back centuries through candlelight and sheep, fat and dusty floors, to every human who ever needed that spark. You wake up next to someone you married a week ago. You barely know them. They snore like a war horn and smell like salted fish. Welcome to medieval marriage. Sex on the wedding night. Expected. Witnesses. Sometimes privacy. Maybe a curtain if you're lucky. In some noble houses, people actually waited outside the room to cheer when it was done. Because nothing says romance like your uncle yelling "Huzzah" from the hallway. You didn't just sleep together, you sealed a legal alliance, like a treaty with your body. Falling in love before marriage, rare. Expected to love after marriage, also not guaranteed. A noblewoman might see her husband 3 times a year between battles, courtly travel, and political affairs. There were no dating apps, but there were May Day festivals. That's when the ale flowed, the flowers bloomed, and young folks disappeared into the woods. Some came back with new lovers, some came back expecting. Parents weren't thrilled, but hey, at least it was festive. LOL. You probably had a thin mattress stuffed with straw, shared by multiple people, and covered in stains of various kinds, and soap made with animal fat and ashes. Sexy. Forget latex. The OG condoms were sheep guts, rinsed and reused. Yes, reused. Spicy herbs were thought to cool the passions, others to heat them up. Aphrodisiacs, wine, honey, cinnamon, mandrake, root, and occasionally crushed beetles. Queer love existed, even if the church said otherwise. Some monasteries wrote poetry between monks that could put modern romantics to shame. Cross-dressing, secret trysts, hidden letters, all happened. Humans don't change, just the rules around them do. Missionary was the only holy position. Anything else was unnatural. Doing it on your side, sinful, standing, scandalous. From behind, literally, the devil's work. And don't you dare enjoy it too much. That was suspect. There were over 180 holy days a year when sex was forbidden. Add Sundays, Lent, Advent, fast days, feast days, and random bishop decrees. You were basically celibate half the year, married or not. Priests often asked people if they had done unclean acts in bed, like oral sex, or sex outside of marriage, or ... smiling. Confession booths were the original sex ed class, minus diagrams, plus judgment. Contrary to myth, chastity belts weren't commonly used. Most were either symbolic, comedic, or invented later. Real medieval women had less need for iron underwear and more for trustworthy relatives. Caught in adultery, you might be whipped or paraded through town with a sign around your neck. In some cities, a woman had to shave her head, a man pay a massive fine. Moral of the story: be discreet or be broke. Brothels were legal in many towns, usually outside the city gates. They were taxed, regulated, and sometimes even run by the church. Yeah, irony. Red lights, candles, silk robes, tri-burlap, and body odor. Knights wrote poems to noble ladies they couldn't touch. Ladies sent handkerchiefs, apples, or riddles back. It was all very platonic, symbolic, and sexually repressed. But it made for great storytelling. People believed certain moon phases made sex more potent. You were told not to conceive during a thunderstorm, bad omens, and never sleep with a man who has sweaty feet. Not superstition, just common sense. Medical texts believed female orgasm was necessary for conception. So yes, some effort was made. Not always skillfully, but the idea that women were passive. Nah, some women knew exactly what they liked. Old cookbooks sometimes contained fertility-preventing recipes. Parsley, pennyroyal, and mugwort tea were common ingredients, or a dash of witchcraft, depending who you asked. Side effects: everything from mild cramps to full exorcism. King Philip IV's daughters-in-law were caught cheating on a tower rooftop. The scandal rocked France. Heads rolled, literally. Everyone escorted the couple to bed, threw coins on them, and wished them ... fertility. Romantic. Mortifying, you decide. Girls could be married by 12, boys by 14, sometimes earlier. It was less young love and more economic alliance. Emotional maturity, irrelevant. Property transfer, essential. Or not remarry at all. Some even ran businesses or joined religious orders. In a weird twist, death sometimes gave women more power than marriage ever did. Everyone knew everyone's business. If you had a secret lover, it wasn't secret for long. Taverns, churches, markets, they were the medieval Twitter. Only difference, instead of likes, you got rumors. Love potions were a whole cottage industry. Want someone to fall in love with you? Boil their hair in wine and make them drink it? Yes, ooh. Witches offered aphrodisiacs, fertility charms, and revenge powders. Effective, debatable, popular. Very. Midwives not only helped with births, They offered sex advice. They tracked cycles, brewed contraceptives, and knew all the town's secrets. Some were revered, some were burned as witches. Go figure. In some places, widows were forced to lie next to their dead husbands one last time. Part of mourning, part of superstition. Comforting, creepy, you decide. Many saints wrote about sexual temptation. Saint Augustine confessed his struggles. Saint Jerome warned women not to bathe to often it inflamed desire. Apparently, even saints couldn't stop thinking about it. Today, we worry about ghosting. Back then, you worried about famine, sin, and plague, while trying to get some people still wanted love, intimacy, escape, and connection. And that's the thread tying us to every century. If you had to choose one medieval sex ritual to bring back, what would it be? May Day in the woods, sheep, intestine, condense, aphrodisiac, honey wine. Drop your answer in the comments. I dare you. You wake up in a hayloft. Your back itches. Your downstairs area itches more. You're not alone. The medieval world is crawling with diseases, and not just metaphorically. Welcome to the era before penicillin. Syphilis exploded in Europe around the 1490s, late medieval, but devastating. Before that, gonorrhea, herpes, and a grab bag of fun fungal infections. Doctors mostly guessed leach it out was a common cure. Spoiler, it didn't work. Mercury ointments, hot irons, herbs that made you vomit. One doctor recommended washing with vinegar and fasting for 40 days. Another, just stop having sex. Revolutionary. Paris had over 100 licensed brothels. They were often placed near rivers, symbolic. Maybe convenient for escape. Definitely inside. Thin walls, straw beds, candles, and maybe a musician if it was payday. Many sex workers were poor, widowed, or outcast. Some were kidnapped, others chose it. They weren't treated well, but some gained wealth, protection, even power. Everyone visited brothels. Yes, everyone. Monks, priests, merchants, kings, Pope, Sixtus IV even taxed them. That's right, the church profited off sex work. Found in excavations, wooden dildos, bronze phalluses, and leather harnesses. Some were ceremonial, some were definitely not. Pleasure didn't stop for lack of electricity. Monks wrote love poems to other monks, hidden in the margins of books. Nuns passed passionate letters under convent doors. One wrote, "My soul is on fire when I hear your voice." Shakespeare, who? Monasteries weren't always celibate. Some were hotbeds of secret relationships, hidden pregnancies, and forbidden love. One nun disguised herself as a monk and lived in a male monastery for years. No one noticed. Some medieval manuscripts had illustrations of monks spanking nuns or animals in compromising positions. Why? No one knows. But some historians think monks just got ... bored. Or maybe they were trolling future generations. Priests weren't supposed to marry or have sex. Spoiler, many did. One bishop in Germany had 6 kids. Another priest left his land to his housekeeper, who everyone knew was more than that. Books were written about women, rarely by them. But some bold ladies' queens, mystics, rebels wrote about their longings, their frustrations, and their fantasies. By the late medieval period, the witch hunts began. Midwives, herbalists, sexually independent women, they were all suspect. Sexual dreams, proof of demonic contact. Having too many lovers, witchcraft, obviously. Self-pleasure was considered a grievous sin. Some texts claimed it caused blindness. Others said it let demons enter your body. Medieval boys were sometimes chained at night to resist temptation. Some religious orders preached total celibacy. Others didn't even try. A monk named Peter Damien warned that sex among clergy was rampant on, as destructive as fire in dry grass. Spoiler, no one listened to Peter. People believed sex during eclipses could produce monsters. A child born from impure acts might be cursed, sickly, or even possessed. Yes, the stars were watching and judging. You're a peasant girl. A traveling knight flirts with you at the tavern. He's got money, charm, and a feather in his hat. You sneak away together, and 9 months later, you're raising his illegitimate child while he's off crusading. Typical. Some monks claimed late-night prayers helped suppress lustful urges. Others confessed those prayers made it worse. One even wrote, "I cannot chant without my loins stirring." Bless him for his honesty. Some medieval doctors prescribed sex as a cure. Women suffering from a wandering womb were told to marry immediately. For men, sex was a way to release excess humors. Convenient, right? In southern France, women ran mock courts to debate love problems. Should a lady forgive a cheating knight? Can one love to people? It was half game, half gossip, and all about romantic drama. Family trees got weird. Cousins married cousins to keep land in the family. But you couldn't marry too close. The church kept charts. One nobleman had to pay a huge fine for accidentally marrying his ... And, whoops, medieval poetry wasn't all religious hymns. There were limericks about farting, jokes about nuns in bed, and full-on erotic verse. One popular tale involved a man who accidentally put his nose in the wrong place. We'll leave it at that. As people died by war, plague, childbirth, they often confessed their sins of the flesh. Some begged forgiveness, some whispered the name of someone they loved or lusted after. It's a reminder, no matter the era, sex and death were never far apart. So what does it all mean today? It means we didn't invent sexual complexity, or shame, or joy, or kink. We just changed the rules and got better lighting. If you lived in medieval times, who would you be? The herbalist brewing love potions, the scribe hiding erotic poems in books, the village gossip, the fearless nun, or just someone trying to love in a world full of plague and judgment? Tell us in the comments. If you've made it this far, you're basically a medieval sex historian now. Like, subscribe, and drop your favorite fact in the comments, or your weirdest "we're not picky." You're holding the hand of someone you love. Outside, the plague cart rolls by. Church bells toll. Smoke clogs the air. But inside, it's quiet. You whisper a vow. A kiss, maybe the last. Love didn't stop for pandemics. In fact, it burned brighter. Many couples defied the rules. They married in fields, exchanged vows in stables, kissed under the moon instead of in cathedrals. Forbidden love stories. They weren't rare. They were everywhere, just rarely written down. Real story. In 14th century France, a man was caught having relations with a dead woman. Instead of execution, the town forced him to marry her. They held a public wedding. The corpse wore a veil. Medieval justice, both horrifying and darkly ironic. Pigs were tried for indecent acts. Roosters were burned for laying eggs. In one bizarre case, a goat was accused of seducing a monk. The goat was acquitted. The monk was not. Some believed lusty ghosts visited in the night, especially widows. These phantom lovers were blamed for everything from pregnancy to emotional breakdowns. Modern translation: it wasn't me, it was the ghost. One man sued his wife for too much desire. Another sued her husband for being too cold. There were annulments over impotence, celibacy, bad breath, and you guessed it, flatulence. Yes, even medieval lovers had their limits. Forget boring ballads. Peasants sang songs about lusty shepherds, milkmaids who accidentally fell in love, and monks caught in barns. Some tunes were so spicy they were banned from taverns. Naturally, they became wildly popular. Medieval people believed sex could lead you to heaven or damn you forever. But most lived somewhere in between. They sinned, they prayed, they hoped for mercy. Sound familiar? Imagine you're in a tavern. Candlelight flickers. Someone catches your eye. You laugh, you lean in. You know it's risky, but life is short. You kiss. That moment, timeless. Because history isn't just kings and wars. It's sweat and skin and heartbreak. It's human. Sex shaped laws, religions, cultures, and still does. They had passion, secrets, shame, joy. They wanted to be touched, to be understood, to be more than just bodies, just like us. People today like to imagine the past was pure, clean, chaste. It wasn't. The medieval world was raw, messy, erotic, and very human. Your eyes hold me captive. Your lips promise storms. Let my soul burn if I can call you mine. Written in the margin of a prayer book, proof that even monks had game. That sex in the Middle Ages wasn't simple. It was dangerous, passionate, regulated, and rebellious. It was whispered in shadows, sung in fields, and carved into church walls. We've got better plumbing, less syphilis, better communication, but love, desire, complicated feelings, those haven't changed one bit. So tonight, when you swipe right or send that you up text, remember, you're part of a 1,000-year-old story. Your great-grandparents probably did the same thing, just with worse lighting and more fleas. If you lived back then, would you follow the rules? Or sneak out to the stables under moonlight? Let me know in the comments. If this video made you laugh, cringe, or rethink medieval monks forever, give it a like, subscribe for more weird history, and share it with a friend who loves spicy facts. The sign behind the silence: you wake up on a straw-stuffed mattress in a freezing stone room. The smell of damp wool and last night's stew hangs in the air. Your thighs ache, not from passion, but from riding a horse for 3 days straight. This is not a love story. This is medieval Europe. Outside, the church bells toll. Not for a wedding, not for a funeral, but for the morning confession. Everyone sins, and in a world where disease, hunger, and war stalk you daily, your thoughts often wander to pleasures, the ones you're told will damn you. Let's get one thing straight. Sex wasn't just taboo. It was dangerous, spiritually, socially, and sometimes ... lethally. The church didn't just frown upon fornication. It built entire walls of fear around it. Every touch, every glance, every longing was loaded with guilt. You're told that sex is sacred, only for marriage, only for procreation, never for fun. But guess what? People are people. Even in 1320, they wanted, they fantasized, they risked it anyway. But you couldn't just have sex. No, it had to follow a sacred script. No loud noises, no lights, no laughter, and definitely no eye contact during climax. That might invite the devil in. Literally, even married couples were expected to abstain during Lent, Advent, Fridays, Sundays, before communion, during menstruation, pregnancy, and 40 days after childbirth. Sound exhausting? It was. You want to know how people felt about sex? Afraid, repressed, obsessed. They talked about it in whispers, punished it in public, and indulged in it, in the dark. And yet, behind closed doors, the truth was messier, more honest. Passion still lived. People broke rules. They always do. The more forbidden something is, the more tempting it becomes. The church said that sex was only moral if it was open to life. That meant anything else, oral, anal, even touching yourself, was a fast track to hell. Yes, masturbation could get you eternal fire. But let's not pretend everyone obeyed. The confession booth became a revolving door of sin. Priests knew your deepest urges, and sometimes they had their own. Some offered penance, others, propositions. You're a peasant woman, 23, already had 5 children. You've buried 2. Your husband smells like sheep dung and ale. You haven't felt a touch of romance in years. So when the traveling baker winks at you, you think about it. Of course you do. But you can't act on it, not publicly. Adultery meant public shaming, whipping, branding, or worse. If you're lucky, they'd just shave your head and send you into the street with a sign reading whore. Still, some took the risk. Desire doesn't care about laws or churches or consequences. Desire finds cracks in even the thickest walls. And then there were the unmarried virgins, by force, not choice. A girl of 13 might be betrothed. A boy of 16 might be lectured about wet dreams and demons. And everyone pretended chastity was easy. You try to sleep, but you hear them. The moans from the hayloft, the hurried footsteps down the back stair, the stifled gasp behind the barn. Love was hidden. Lust was everywhere. And yet, if you got caught, the consequences weren't just social. They could be divine. You could be blamed for the plague, for the bad harvest, for a dead child, because sex out of bounds brought wrath. But not all sins were equal. A nobleman sleeping with his servant, quietly forgiven. A servant caught with a stable boy, burned or banished. Or worse, married off. Sometimes the church forced couples to marry after being caught. A wedding not of love, but punishment. Your vows spoken in shame. So you learned to hide, to lie, to write love letters in code, to meet in woods and shadows, to live for a moment that would never be recorded in history, but burned like fire in your chest. You live in a time where a single kiss could ruin you, but you also live in a time where a kiss is the only real thing you felt all year. The silence is thick, it's taught, it's enforced, but behind it, people still ache, still reach for one another, still fall into beds, into arms, into sin. And that is where the story really begins. The brothel isn't where saints go, but then again, neither is the castle or the village chapel. In medieval Europe, sex was traded just like wool, wine, or grain, only with more shame, secrecy, and perfume. You push open a door under a red lantern. The air smells of roses, sweat, and cheap wine. A lute plays faintly in the background. You're in a medieval brothel, not the seedy, but a bustling, organized business. Contrary to the myths, it's not all filth and violence. Sure, danger lingers, but so does elegance. The women here, some wear silk, Some can recite poetry. Some wield more social power than your average peasant man. Sex work was legal in many towns, regulated, taxed, and strategically placed far enough from the church, but close enough to keep demand steady. The church condemned it, of course, but secretly it preferred containment. Better here than defiling virgins, they said, as if the bodies of poor women were just holy shock absorbers for men's desires. A girl named Alice opens a curtain. She's barely 17, cheeks powdered, lips stained with crushed berries. Her job isn't just sex, it's performance, comfort, illusion. She's heard every story. She sells fantasy, not flesh. Some brothels were owned by women, former sex workers, now madams, who ran tight ships and protected their girls from violent clients and corrupt guards. Most of the time, others were fronts for political spying. Nobles, drunk on wine and ego, confessed things they never would sober. A whispered word in bed could change a war. But not everyone came by choice. Some were trafficked, bought, inherited like livestock. Others were criminals, sentenced to work in brothels instead of being jailed. Mercy, they called it. In places like London's Southwark or Paris' Rue Gravois, entire red light districts thrived. They had their own rules, their own slang, their own saints. Saint Mary Magdalene, repackaged as the patroness of the fallen. Don't get romantic, though. For every velvet curtain, there was a splintered floorboard. For every giggle, a sob behind a closed door. The work was real, and so was the risk. Condoms didn't exist, but there were crude attempts. Linen soaked in vinegar, lamb intestines tied with string. You don't want to know what they use to clean up after. Diseases spread fast. The French disease, now known as syphilis, left people rotting alive, but shame kept them quiet. Better to die quietly than be branded as unclean. Some women had secret methods to avoid pregnancy, herbal mixtures. You hear laughter behind a curtain. A nobleman leaves, red in the face, handing off a coin without meeting anyone's eye. He'll confess tomorrow, for tonight he's forgiven himself. Outside, a friar crosses the street, quickly, cloak pulled tight. He's not lost, he's a regular. Inside the brothel, stories bloom like bruises. A widow paying off her dead husband's debts. A runaway dressed as a boy to avoid capture. A girl who sings while she works, just to feel human. There were tiers of brothels, too. The high-end stews, with perfumed sheets and wine. And the low-end huts by the docks, where payment came in stale bread or a few fish. Sex wasn't always about pleasure. Sometimes it was about power, survival, revenge, control, or just the need to feel something, anything, in a cold, indifferent world. And yet some women built empires, mistress to a noble, lover to a bishop, keeper of secrets, maker of myths. They were feared and admired, cursed and copied. You wonder, if you had no land, no name, no dowry, would you have done the same? Not all clients were men. Wealthy, noble women came too, in disguise, seeking comfort or curiosity. The brothel didn't judge. The brothel just watched. In some towns, the brothel hosted festivals, wild masked nights where everyone pretended to forget who they were. One night a year, you could kiss a stranger and blame it on the wine. But the moment the sun rose, the masks came off, the shame returned, and the girls went back to being invisible. Yet they kept records, hidden ledgers, initials, tallies of coins earned and lives lost, proof that they existed, that they mattered, even if history didn't care. And now, centuries later, we care. We look back. We ask, who were these people? What did they want? What did they lose? And what did they know about love, pleasure, and pain that we've forgotten? Because under the lace, the grime, the scripture, and the silk, they were just human. The secret sex lives of the church. Nobles and peasants, you kneel in church, head bowed, hands folded, but your thoughts, they're not on salvation. They're on the priest. The way he looked at you during confession, his hand lingered too long, his breath smelled of wine, not penance. The church preached purity, but behind closed doors, its servants were far from chaste. Celibacy was the rule in theory. In practice, some even had children, raised in secret or passed off as nephews. The church turned a blind eye until someone complained. And nuns, don't assume they were immune. Cloisters were supposed to be holy retreats, but sometimes they became bubbles of erotic curiosity. Long hours, tight quarters, and human nature. It doesn't vanish just because you took a vow. A letter from the 14th century describes a convent scandal. Pregnant nuns, illicit lovers sneaking in at night. Confession was often erotic theater. You'd confess your impure thoughts to a man trained to suppress his own. Some priests listened, others ... asked for details. Now shift scenes. A noblewoman lies on her canopied bed, velvet drapes drawn. Her husband is off crusading. She's not lonely, just bored. Enter the night. Romance among nobles wasn't always about love. It was politics, property, bloodlines. But that doesn't mean passion didn't flare. Courtly love. The medieval idea that one could adore a woman from afar, platonically, soulfully. Yeah, that was cute. But it didn't always stay platonic. Letters turned into touches, songs into secret meetings. Lancelot and Guinevere weren't fiction. They were warning stories. Noblewomen sometimes had more freedom than you'd expect. They ran estates, educated children, hosted salons, and, when the opportunity arose, had discreet affairs. Some kept journals, poems, love letters bound in ribbons. Evidence of desire, not meant for daylight. And then the peasants. Their lives were not poetic, but their desires were real. Sex often came after hard labor, in barns or fields, between chores and prayers. Marriages were pragmatic, but affection still existed. That's not a modern invention. Premarital sex happened, and often, if a girl got pregnant, the village pressured the man to marry her. The medieval shotgun wedding. But for some, love was punishment. Serfs who broke the rules faced public shaming. A man caught with another man, tortured. A woman with another woman, flogged or accused of witchcraft. And yet, it still happened. Love bloomed in secret, between same-sex partners, between different classes, between what was allowed and what was felt. The line between holy and sinful was blurry, and that's where people lived, in the blur. Because even in a world of relics and rosaries, people longed. They kissed in shadows. They whispered in Latin. They risked everything for a few moments of warmth. The secret sex lives of the church. Nobles and peasants, you kneel in church, head bowed, hands folded, but your thoughts, they're not on salvation. They're on the priest. The way he looked at you during confession, his hand lingered too long. His breath smelled of wine, not penance. The church preached purity, but behind closed doors, its servants were far from chaste. Celibacy was the rule, in theory. In practice, Temptation found its way into monasteries, convents, even the bishop's bed. Priests took concubines, not openly, but commonly. Some even had children, raised in secret or passed off as nephews. The church turned a blind eye until someone complained. And nuns, don't assume they were immune. Cloisters were supposed to be holy retreats, but sometimes they became bubbles of erotic curiosity. Long hours, tight quarters, and human nature. It doesn't vanish just because you took a vow. A letter from the 14th century describes a convent scandal. Punishment: they were sent to another convent, like holy exile. Confession was often erotic theater. You'd confess your impure thoughts to a man trained to suppress his own. Some priests listened, others ... asked for details. Now shift scenes. A noblewoman lies on her canopied bed, velvet drapes drawn. Her husband is off crusading. She's not lonely, just bored. Enter the night. Romance among nobles wasn't always about love. It was politics, property, bloodlines. But that doesn't mean passion didn't flare. Courtly love, the medieval idea that one could adore a woman from afar, platonically, soulfully. Yeah, that was cute. But it didn't always stay platonic. Letters turned into touches, songs into secret meetings. Lancelot and Guinevere weren't fiction. They were warning stories. Noble women sometimes had more freedom than you'd expect. They ran estates, educated children, hosted salons, and, when the opportunity arose, had discreet affairs. Some kept journals, poems, love letters bound in ribbons. And then the peasants. Their lives were not poetic, but their desires were real. Sex often came after hard labor, in barns or fields, between chores and prayers. Marriages were pragmatic. Laughter in the dark. Not everyone waited until marriage. That's not a modern invention. Premarital sex happened. And often, if a girl got pregnant, the village pressured the man to marry her. The medieval shotgun wedding. But for some, love was punishment, flogged or accused of witchcraft. And yet, it still happened. Love bloomed in secret, between same-sex partners, between different classes, between what was allowed and what was felt. The line between holy and sinful was blurry, and that's where people lived, in the blur. Because even in a world of relics and rosaries, people longed. They kissed in shadows. They whispered in Latin. They risked everything for a few moments of warmth. And isn't that the most human thing of all? Let's get something straight. People in the Middle Ages weren't boring in bed. Just because their clothes were layered doesn't mean their fantasies were. In fact, for some, the more restrictive the world was outside the bedroom, the more liberated things got behind closed doors. Let's start with role play. That bar wench outfit. That's not new. Speaking of whipping, flagellation wasn't just for repentance. Some religious fanatics blurred pain and ecstasy. Sounds a lot like BDSM, doesn't it? Some couples enjoyed being tied up. Silk cords, leather straps, even chains. Quietly, of course. You don't exactly want the bishop finding your stash, and voyeurism. Medieval manuscripts are full of strange, erotic drawings, monks fighting snails, nuns harvesting phalluses from trees, rabbits spanking each other. Were they jokes, warnings, or someone's very weird fantasy journal? Maybe all three. In France, a nobleman once threw a masked ball where everyone came dressed as mythical creatures. By midnight, most were naked. It was dubbed a moral disaster. But it inspired others, branded each other with hot coins, intense, very consensual. We hope so. Fetishes weren't limited to objects. They extended to behaviors. Some were aroused by language, whispered prayers, dirty Latin. Others by specific acts, kneeling, silence, being watched. Even in arranged marriages, couples sometimes found common kinks, bonding over shared secrets, a little slap here. Some documents reveal contracts between lovers, agreements to obey, to punish, to perform certain acts. Medieval BDSM kind of sexuality was both controlled and chaotic. On the surface, strict morality. Underneath, endless improvisation. What modern people call kink was often a blend of ritual, rebellion, and raw desire. A response to repression. A way to reclaim the body. So next time someone says the Middle Ages were dull and prudish, remind them they had entire forbidden desires and taboo love stories that changed history. Let's set the stage. A moonlit courtyard. A cloaked figure sneaking past the guard tower. Somewhere behind a stone wall, a heart races. Because in the medieval world, love wasn't just risky, it was war. Take Abelard and Heloise, the OG forbidden couple. He was a brilliant philosopher. She was a gifted student. They fell hard. Secret letters, stolen glances, all the romantic stuff. Then came the scandal. A child, a secret marriage, and finally, punishment. Violent, brutal punishment. Abelard was castrated. Heloise became a nun. Love, medieval style. But did they stop writing? Nope. Their letters survive, full of longing, regret, and emotional complexity that could put any Netflix romance to shame. They weren't the only ones. Across Europe, forbidden affairs brewed between clergy and nuns, knights and queens, peasants and nobles. Some were passionate, some manipulative, all dangerous. A bishop's daughter caught with a stable boy. She was sent to a convent. He disappeared. A merchant's wife seduced by a traveling minstrel. Her family sued. He fled. Love crossed social classes, but it rarely ended well. Sometimes it sparked rebellions. A noblewoman running off with a commoner was more than scandal. It was treason. Sometimes it shaped history. Like when King Edward II of England openly favored Piers Gaveston, a man, their bond, let's say it was, intense. So intense, the nobles had Piers executed. Edward never recovered. Or when Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe, defied her husband, the king, and supported her sons in rebellion. Her motives, political, personal, possibly romantic. Even the church had its affairs. Pope Alexander VI had several mistresses and acknowledged children. His daughter, Lucretia Borgia. Rumors swirled about incest, poisonings, and secret lovers. Were they all true? Maybe not. But the fact people believed them shows just how taboo sex and power had become. Taboo love wasn't always tragic. Some lovers found ways to beat the system, to write, meet, scheme, and stay together. One noble woman disguised herself as a pilgrim to visit her exiled lover in another kingdom. She walked for weeks, carrying a fake relic and a forged letter. She made it. Another woman, accused of adultery, defended herself in court with poetry. She claimed her verses were too pure to come from someone immoral. The judge agreed. And then there were same-sex couples, quiet, hidden, but real. We have court records, letters, even artwork suggesting men and women formed romantic partnerships outside of what society allowed. Risky, unbelievably, but still they tried. One document from Florence mentions two women who lived together as sisters, but were caught in acts of unnatural affection. Their punishment was exile, their story lost, except for that one note. Forbidden desires weren't rare. They were everywhere, just hidden. And yet, despite the punishments, people kept falling in love, crossing lines, defying families, writing poems, riding through storms, leaving everything behind. Why? Because desire doesn't care about laws, or birthright, or class. It wants what it wants. And in a world where your fate could be decided by your last name or your hymen, choosing love was the most radical thing you could do. So next time you hear someone say people in the Middle Ages were boring or repressed, tell them about the lovers who risked everything just for one night, one letter, one touch. Because sometimes, even in the darkest ages, love burned bright. The rise of virginity tests, chastity belts, and public shame. Imagine it's your wedding night. The candles flicker, the bed creaks. The whole village waits to see if a sheet will be stained with blood by morning. Romantic, right? Welcome to medieval virginity culture, a cocktail of fear, obsession, and deeply weird rituals. Let's start with the tests. Virginity wasn't just a concept, it was property, proof of purity, a guarantee that a bride was untouched, and the stakes were sky high. Some women were examined before marriage, by midwives, by mothers-in-law, by priests' wives. That's right, strangers literally inspecting a girl's body for tightness, tone, and an intact hymen. Horrifying, completely. The logic was flawed. Hymens break for many reasons: exercise, horseback riding, even dancing. But science wasn't exactly leading the charge back then. So what if a bride didn't bleed on her wedding night? Panic. Some families accused the bride of deception. Some annulled the marriage. Some punished her severely, beatings, exile, or worse. To protect themselves, some women faked the blood. They hid vials of animal blood, or pricked their fingers, or used beet juice. The goal: stain that sheet, no matter what. And yes, the sheet was often displayed in the town square, on the family wall, proof that honor had been defended. Now let's talk about chastity belts. Were they real? That's been debated. Some were symbolic, worn during ceremonies or portraits. Others may have been practical, used to prevent rape during war or pilgrimage. But most of the terrifying metal contraptions in museums, probably fakes from the 19th century, when people became weirdly fascinated with medieval torture. Still, the idea tells us a lot. The female body was a locked vault. Men held the key, and if they couldn't trust the woman, they'd rather trust a literal padlock. There was no male version, by the way. Honor was gendered. Men could sin and be forgiven. Women had to be spotless, literally, and the church, it had plenty to say. Virgin martyrs were glorified, girls who chose death over defilement. Saints like Agnes and Cecilia were celebrated for resisting rape and remaining pure. Sexual shame became holiness. Pleasure was suspect. Bodies were battlegrounds. In some towns, unmarried pregnant women were paraded with shaved heads and naked feet. Public shaming as policy. Even rumors could destroy a woman. Whispers of premarital sex were enough to ruin reputations, dowries, and futures. But let's be clear, not everyone played by the rules. Some women lied, cleverly, boldly, out of necessity. Some bribed examiners. Some paid other women to take their place. Some married, already pregnant, and convinced everyone the baby came early. They gamed a system stacked against them. Meanwhile, male hypocrisy thrived. A nobleman might demand a virgin bride while keeping multiple lovers. A priest might preach purity after visiting brothels. A merchant might abandon his mistress for a more respectable wife. And speaking of brothels, they were everywhere. Licensed, taxed, sometimes even church-owned. A strange irony, isn't it? Publicly shaming women for sex, while profiting off it behind closed doors. Prostitutes were both condemned and needed, called sinners, but used for protection. The idea being that men could sleep with sex workers instead of seducing virgins. Medieval logic was twisted like that. There were even laws that forced prostitutes to wear specific colors or bells on their dresses, as if shame should be heard before it's seen. Still, many of these women had more autonomy than wives. They earned money, lived outside strict family rules. In some cities, one Venetian courtesan was so influential that nobles bribed her for introductions to political leaders. Her power, sex, wit, and information. So while virginity was idolized, experience was also secretly respected, if it served the right people. The hypocrisy wasn't just personal, it was structural. Kings annulled marriages by claiming their queens weren't virgins, even if they were. Powerful men used the concept of purity as a weapon, and some women weaponized it right back. One noblewoman accused of premarital sex challenged her accuser to trial by combat. She picked a champion. He won. She walked free, her purity officially restored by sword. So what did virginity really mean? Control, reputation, currency. It wasn't about biology. It was about power. A woman's value was tied to something invisible and unprovable, which made it easy to manipulate. And that pressure didn't just vanish after marriage. Wives were expected to be obedient, loyal, and eternally faithful. Husbands, not so much. But in secret diaries, hidden poems, and quiet letters, you find women pushing back. One wife wrote a journal full of sexual advice for her daughter. How to please a husband, but also how to avoid him when needed. Another hid love poems to a female servant between the pages of her prayer book. Resistance didn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it was survival through secrecy, and even among all the shame, blood, and control, women found ways to reclaim their stories. They faked the tests, they twisted the rules, they survived. Because when a whole society tries to trap your body in an idea, the most radical thing you can do is know it's still yours. Pleasure potions, aphrodisiacs, and medieval sex cures. So, you're not feeling the fire. The marriage bed is colder than a monk's bathwater. What do? Simple. You visit the village, which maybe not a full-on broomstick witch, but an herb woman, a healer, a seller of remedies. Welcome to the steamy, smoky, often shady world of medieval sex cures. Let's start with aphrodisiacs. Everything was an aphrodisiac, or so they hoped. Oysters, absolutely. Sparrow brains, yep. Mash them into wine, and allegedly, you'd be frisky in minutes. Onions, mustard seeds, honey, mint, and even basil were believed to stir lust. Men rubbed potions on their groins. Women drank infusions before bed. Everyone was chasing that spark. But not all cures were friendly. Some were straight up terrifying. Want an erection potion. Try dried wolf penis powder mixed with goat fat and rose water. No, how about ground up ants baked into a tart? If that didn't work, doctors blamed everything from cold blood to an imbalance of humors, so they prescribed leeches or cupping or enemas made of hot milk and crushed herbs. Not hot. Women weren't spared either. If a lady had no desire, it wasn't seen as normal. It was a disorder, a disease. So midwives brewed warming tonics. These included cinnamon, ginger, and wait for it, dried bear testicles. And if a woman's womb was said to have wandered from lack of sex, a real belief, healers tried to lure it back. They placed sweet-smelling herbs at the vagina and foul ones at the nose. The idea tempted the womb to return to its rightful place. Now imagine being the test subject. Okay, Justina, lie down. I'm wafting wormwood at your face now. You can't make this stuff up. Some potions were poetic, like love's quickening draught, made from crushed rose petals, honey, saffron, and wine. Others were terrifying, like concoctions involving menstrual blood, snake oil, or powdered bone. And let's not forget magic. Spells, charms, and talismans were big business. Women tied love knots into their husbands' clothing. Men buried charms under their lover's doorstep. One recipe advised men to rub their genitals with a paste made of ivy, honey, and the ashes of a dove. Yes, dove ashes, for virility. But love potions weren't always about passion. Sometimes they were about control. A woman might slip herbs into her husband's food to make him faithful, or sleepy, or too exhausted to visit the mistress across town. Some used mandrake, a powerful and hallucinogenic root, to make a man obsessed. Others used belladonna, which could mimic beauty by dilating pupils, but also kill you. Desire and danger often mixed freely, and it wasn't just peasants dabbling. Nobles, queens, even clergy commissioned aphrodisiac recipes from apothecaries. One bishop reportedly paid a fortune for a blend of rhino horn and saffron. Did it work? Probably not, but it made a great conversation starter. Let's pause and talk about the church's stance. Officially, sex was only for procreation, pleasure, suspicious, but unofficially, priests got it on. Monks flirted, nuns fell in love, and the clergy had access to the best herbalists. Some monasteries even kept secret manuals of remedies for everything from impotence to lust. One such text advised a mix of aniseed, fennel, and mint, served with red wine and massaged into the feet. Apparently, sexy toes were all the rage. Medieval medicine didn't just try to ignite lust, it tried to fix performance problems. Can't finish. Must be too much melancholy. Can't start. Clearly, your liver is cold. Solutions ranged from goat blood baths to singing certain psalms while touching specific body parts. We're talking sex ed meets exorcism. And still, in all this strangeness, you find echoes of modern desire. People wanted love, passion, satisfaction. They feared rejection. They longed for connection. They just had limited tools. Instead of therapy, they had saints. Instead of toys, they had turnips. Instead of consent workshops, they had sermons. But some figured it out. A merchantess wife kept a detailed book of erotic recipes, one with honey and crushed pine nuts that she swore gave the night wings. A male scholar in Paris secretly compiled interviews with sex workers about what brought women pleasure, then buried it in the university library. And across Europe, Midwives passed down whispered advice to daughters, nieces, and neighbors, because behind the potions, behind the nonsense, people shared knowledge. They trusted experience more than doctrine, lived truths more than texts. And while a lot of it was trial and error, some of it worked. One recipe for boosting libido, a warm drink of saffron, cinnamon, nutmeg, and wine, still used today in parts of the Middle East. Another for calming performance anxiety, lavender oil on the chest, still a favorite in aromatherapy. Not everything was madness, but much of it was secret, because pleasure, especially female pleasure, had to be hidden. So people brewed at night, whispered recipes, traded roots in shadowed markets. Sex cures weren't just about lust, they were quiet acts of rebellion, a way to take control in a world obsessed with control over you, a way to say, I want more, a way to remember, I am more than someone's property. And centuries later, in dusty books and crumbling scrolls, you still find their legacy. Saffron-stained pages, spells scrawled in the margins, notes like, this worked for Marta, twice. The past may have been cold, repressive, even cruel, but beneath it, a fire smoldered, and it burned for joy. Same-sex love, secret affairs, and the hidden queer lives of the Middle Ages. It's the year 1347. You live in a bustling port town. The bells ring for vespers. The streets smell of salted fish, wet stone, and wood smoke, and you're in love with someone you're not allowed to love, not because of family or class, because they're the same sex as you. Let's talk about queer love in the Middle Ages. First, the myths. No, it wasn't all dungeons and pitchforks. Not every gay person was burned at the stake. Yes, the church officially condemned sodomy, a term so broad it could include anything from masturbation to oral sex, but real life, real people, far more complicated. In cities like Florence, London, and Paris, same-sex desire lived in the shadows, but also in poetry, letters, and coded friendships. Let's start with men. In some towns, young apprentices developed deep bonds with their masters. These relationships, while often platonic, sometimes tipped into intimacy. In Florence, so many men were charged with sodomy in the 1300s that the city created a special board, the Office of the Night. Its job, investigate, accuse, and shame. But prosecutions were rare. Most cases were dismissed. Why? Because everyone was doing it. They just didn't talk about it. Or if they did, they used poetry. Men wrote sonnets about their dear friends, swore eternal loyalty, shared beds on long pilgrimages. Sound romantic. It was, now, the women. Lesbian relationships are harder to trace, not because they didn't exist, but because society didn't see women as sexual agents. If two women loved each other, they were just close companions. They braided hair, wrote letters, ran away together, shared rooms, and occasionally were accused of witchcraft, because, surely, no good woman would turn down a man. In 1477, 2 German women were put on trial. Why? They had lived as man and wife for years. One even dressed in men's clothes. The verdict? One was exiled. The other was executed. But they weren't the only ones. Stories trickled through Europe of women fleeing convents together, men renouncing marriage to live with male partners, soldiers who fought side by side and died holding hands. Some records survive, most don't, because the people living these stories had to be careful. They used codes, symbols, quiet glances, letters burned after reading. One man wrote, My soul is bound to yours in a love not made for daylight. A woman, hiding her affection in a song, ended the verse with, "Your voice brings me more joy than all the saints." Even in monasteries and convents, where same-sex living was the norm, passion bloomed. Priests shared beds, nuns shared secrets, and sometimes more than that. There's a record of two abbesses who exchanged rings, took vows of fidelity, and were buried side by side, their tomb inscribed with a single word, sorors, sisters. But they weren't sisters, they were soulmates. Let's not sugarcoat this though, it was dangerous. Homosexual acts could be punished by whipping, exile, even death. But many people still risked it, because the heart wants what it wants. Some joined religious orders to avoid heterosexual marriage and found freedom behind the walls. Others lived as the opposite gender, not always because they were queer, but because it gave them choices. A few because it was who they truly were. In the 14th century, a person named John Eleanor Rykener was arrested in London for having sex with men while dressed as a woman. Their case confused the courts. Was this sodomy, prostitution, cross-dressing? Modern scholars see Rykener as one of the earliest documented transgender or gender non-conforming individuals in medieval Europe. The truth: people like Rykener existed everywhere. We just lost their names. Let's talk about language. There was no gay or lesbian back then. Instead, you had words like unnatural love, hermaphrodite, tribade, sodomite, ganymede, each one a cloak, each one a warning. But hidden in the language was longing. A knight might write of friendship forged in fire. A lady might describe her companion as her other soul, and sometimes they'd risk everything. In a 13th century romance, a woman disguises herself as a man to follow her lover. When discovered, the king pardons her, because love, he declares, should never be punished. That was fiction, but it reflected a truth people desperately hoped for, and sometimes found. There are records of same-sex couples buried together, of secret ceremonies, of passion letters preserved in hidden diaries, and of entire communities, sailors, traveling performers, wandering monks, who created their own rules, their own families, their own loves. Queer people weren't anomalies. They were part of the tapestry, often invisible, but always there. So next time someone tells you queer history started in the 20th century, remind them, in the heart of medieval Europe, under candlelight and silence, love bloomed, dangerous, beautiful, real, and they dared to feel it anyway. The bedroom politics of queens, mistresses, and scandalous courtiers. The palace is quiet, but not empty. Behind the velvet curtains, silk rustles, not from gowns, from secrets. Because in royal courts, the most dangerous power play wasn't made with a sword or a scroll. It was made in the bedroom. You're a queen, or a lady in waiting, or a powerful courtesan. You know that your body isn't just yours, it's leverage. Let's talk about how sex, scandal, and status were tangled together like lace corsets in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. First, the queen. Her marriage was political, her virginity a matter of state. On her wedding night, witnesses waited outside the chamber to hear the proof groans, maybe even blood-stained sheets. Because if there was no consummation, there was no alliance. But that didn't stop kings from seeking pleasure elsewhere. Enter the royal mistress. In France, they had a name, maîtresse intérieure, the official mistress. She had apartments, servants, jewelry, and influence, sometimes more than the queen herself. Agnes Sorel, mistress to Charles VII, was so powerful she changed court fashion. Deep, plunging necklines. That was her idea. She also advised the king on state matters, while half naked. But it wasn't just France. In England, mistresses shaped policy. Anne Boleyn began as a lady-in-waiting. Her flirtation with Henry VIII brought down a queen, created a new religion, and started a political crisis that lasted generations. All with a raised eyebrow and a refusal to sleep with him until he put a crown on her head. Spoiler, he did. Then he killed her. The stakes were always high, but queens weren't passive. Catherine the Great took lovers by the dozen. She rewarded them with titles, land, and power. Is that medieval? Maybe late, but she wasn't the first. Isabella of France, married to the ineffectual Edward II, orchestrated a coup with her lover, Roger Mortimer. They took the throne temporarily, and Dante forget Margaret of Anjou, rumored to have had a passionate affair with the Duke of Suffolk, while ruling in her husband's name. Power, pleasure, treason, sometimes all three. Now, court life was a maze of etiquette, but under the silken song, it was a battlefield. Ladies competed not just for husbands, but for favor. A raised hem, a whispered compliment, a glimpse of ankle in a garden, all calculated. And yes, people noticed. Court poets immortalized affairs. Gossip flowed faster than wine. Did you hear about Lady Cecily and the bishop's nephew? She was seen entering his chambers after matins, twice. Some tried to use love as a ladder. A well-placed kiss could get your cousin a knighthood. A warm bed could save your father from exile. But it was risky. One wrong rumor, and you were ruined, banished, shamed, or worse. In 1399, Queen Joanna of Naples had her lovers publicly executed when accused of treason. One was stabbed while bathing. Another hung from the castle gates because desire in the wrong hands was a threat. And not just to the crown, to the church. Clerics railed against courtly love. The flirtation between nobles, often adulterous, almost always passionate. Troubadours sang about it. Knights died for it. But priests condemned it. Love that is not for procreation is love for damnation, they said. Still, the dances continued. Masked balls, moonlit hunts, secret messages slipped into gloves, and always the risk. Even the king wasn't safe. Edward II's intimate relationship with Piers Gaveston scandalized England. Louis XIV's many mistresses competed with his ministers for influence, and Henry IV of France had so many lovers, his mistresses had their own mistresses. Let's pause. What's the takeaway? In royal courts, sex wasn't just a private act, it was public policy. Your bedroom was a battlefield, your partner an ally or an enemy. Love was currency, lust was leverage, and silence the deadliest weapon. Because if you spoke too freely, loved too loudly, or bedded the wrong body, you didn't just lose status, you lost your head. But if you played it right, you became legend. So next time someone calls court life romantic, remember, every love letter was a gamble, every kiss a conspiracy, and the most powerful players weren't always the ones wearing crowns. Virginity, marriage, beds, and the business of medieval sex. Imagine you're a young noblewoman. Your dress is stiff with embroidery, your face powdered white, your hands tremble. Not because of love, because tonight you become proof of purity, of honor, of your father's business deal. Welcome to the medieval wedding night, where sex wasn't just personal, it was public currency. Let's strip back the veil. First, virginity. it wasn't a choice, it was a status symbol. A woman's worth, especially among nobles, was tightly bound to her purity. Not just spiritual, physical. Your hymen, it was practically a legal document. If you lacked it, or bled too little, the consequences could be catastrophic. Annulments, public shame, broken alliances. So, they got creative. Women inserted goose blood, pigs' bladders filled with red wine, carefully timed screams, all to fake the bloody sheets the morning after, because make no mistake, people waited for them. Literally, family members, court officials, priests, outside the bedchamber, whispering, listening, sometimes even inspecting the linens. Yes, it's that gross, but that was the business. Marriage was never about love. It was about land, titles, and legacy. Sex was a contract. Consummation sealed the deal, and the woman's role, deliver an heir, preferably male. Now, not everyone was noble. Let's head to the countryside. You're a peasant girl, because if the boy didn't marry you after, you were ruined, unmarriable, damaged goods. Unless you were wealthy, then you could pay for a quiet convent entry or a hasty wedding. But poor girls, no such luck. They faced shame, punishment, or worse, abandonment. The church preached chastity, but reality was messy. Premarital sex happened. A lot, so much that some towns held hand-fasting ceremonies, informal unions, to let couples test the waters before a priest made it official. Kind of like medieval engagement with benefits. Now back to the upper class. Sometimes, noblemen preferred to marry women who weren't virgins. Why? They were seen as more experienced, less naive, also safer, because noblemen didn't want surprises on their wedding night, or tears. But officially, virgin brides were still preferred. Hence the elaborate inspections and the legends. Like the chastity belt, was it real? Historians mostly say no, at least not widespread, but the fear behind it was very real. A woman's fidelity determined the legitimacy of her children, and therefore the future of dynasties. So controlling her body became paramount. Enter the dowry. Sex and money were linked from day one. The larger your dowry, the better your match. A rich father could marry his daughter into nobility, a poor one into servitude, or nothing at all. And if a woman was raped before marriage, dowry negotiations collapsed, which led to horrific choices. Sometimes, victims were forced to marry their rapists to restore their value. Let that sink in. Even consensual love had limits. Crossing class lines was taboo. A noblewoman who loved a stable boy, that was a death sentence, or at least a convent. But a nobleman with a peasant mistress, tolerated, even expected, because double standards weren't just cultural, they were systemic. Let's talk annulments. If a marriage wasn't consummated, it could be dissolved. So, proving sex happened was crucial. Couples were interrogated, sometimes examined. If the man couldn't perform, he was publicly humiliated. If the woman refused, she was branded disobedient. In one famous case, a French court made a husband perform in front of witnesses to prove his potency. Awkward, yes. Terrifying, also yes. But again, sex was business. And everyone, the church, the family, the community, had a stake. Even the bed itself played a role. Some couples had their beds blessed, sprinkled with holy water. Others were paraded through the town before their wedding night, because the marriage wasn't just personal, it was political, economic, religious, and everyone wanted a piece. What about love? It happened, Quietly, carefully, hidden glances, smuggled letters, shared prayers. But love was the exception, not the expectation. The rule was duty. Your body belonged first to your father, then to your husband. Your desires didn't matter. Your obedience did. Let's not romanticize it. The medieval marriage bed was often cold, frightening, transactional, but it was also, sometimes, the beginning of real connection. Couples who started as strangers grew fond, loyal, even affectionate. But that came later. First came fear, then blood, then silence, and then life. Because from that wedding night came children, and from them more alliances, more wars, more history. It all started here, in that room, with two strangers, a bed, and 1,000 years of expectation. So next time someone says, medieval love story, ask them, did it begin with affection or an audience? The rise of prostitution, brothels, and forbidden pleasures, it's late. The castle sleeps, the fields are quiet. But in the shadows of the town walls, things are just beginning. You smell ale, sweat, perfumed hair oil. You hear lute music, flirtatious giggles, a sharp slap, followed by laughter. You've entered the medieval brothel. Welcome to the red light district of the past, where sex wasn't whispered about. It was traded, taxed, and tangled in every corner of society. Let's talk about the oldest profession. Prostitution in the medieval world wasn't just tolerated. In many places, it was institutionalized. Churches condemned it publicly, but towns licensed it. Because if you can't stop it, you might as well regulate it. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, brothels were often run by city councils. Yes, local government was your pimp. No operating near churches, no working on Sundays, and heaven forbid, no serving married men from noble houses. Rules were bent. You heard that right. Some even kept mistresses, calling them housekeepers. The hypocrisy. Now, brothels weren't always the seedy dens you might picture. Silken sheets, musicians, imported wine, high-end courtesans catered to knights, merchants, even royalty. They weren't just bodies for rent. They were educated, witty, skilled in conversation and poetry. Think of them as the medieval geishas of Europe. But that was the top tier. Streetwalkers, alley girls, traveling camp followers who tailed armies to sell comfort to soldiers. Orphans, widows, victims of war or famine, sometimes fleeing worse fates. Syphilis, called the French disease or the Great Pox, rotted faces and ruined lives. And if you grew too old, you were discarded, because the same town that licensed you could also arrest you, especially when the church flexed its moral muscle. In a world where women had few rights, prostitutes made money. They lived outside the normal rules, like Agnes de Roches, who started as a brothel cleaner in Avignon and ended up running one of the largest pleasure houses in France. Or Lucretia, a Roman madam who paid bribes to cardinals and dined with diplomats. They were survivors, strategists. Now, let's peel back the curtain. You're a customer. Maybe incense burns to hide the stench of unwashed bodies. Her name isn't real. From the plague, the war, the crushing weight of sin. Brothels generated taxes. They supported taverns, bathhouses, musicians. Even the church profited indirectly. Many bishops owned land rented by brothel keepers. Let that sink in. Moral panics, riots, bonfires of vanity, where makeup, wigs, and corsets were burned. Some towns expelled sex workers completely, only to sneak them back months later. Then there were the hidden pleasures, forbidden kinks, same-sex love, cross-dressing performers in night markets. The church called it sin. Sex workers had a dress code in many cities: yellow hoods, striped cloaks, specific jewelry. This marked them, but also advertised them. Some women used it to their advantage. Now, don't romanticize it. That would be rewriting history. These women, and some men, lived in the cracks of society, a whispered resistance to the rules, an underground economy of need, and in their own way, a rebellion. So next time you imagine medieval life, don't picture only knights and cloisters. The woman behind it, waiting, watching, surviving. Because behind every history of kings and queens, there's the story they never told you, and it moans, laughs, and sings in the dark. Medieval kinks, taboo fantasies, and the underground world of pleasure. Forget everything you think you know about medieval morality. Sure, there were rules, preaching, punishments, public shame, but there were also locked chests under beds, secret manuscripts, carvings hidden beneath church pews. Desire didn't disappear, it just ducked underground and took its fantasies with it. Let's dive into the unspoken, the forbidden, the kinks of the medieval world. And oh yes, there were plenty. You might think the Middle Ages were prudish, and in public they often were. But behind closed doors, people weren't just engaging in sex. They were imagining it in all kinds of strange, scandalous ways. We're talking about fantasy. It crept into everything. Dream visions in poetry, erotic riddles passed between lovers. Even religious art sometimes blurred the line between the sacred and the sensual, with saints painted in ecstasy that looked suspiciously familiar. Let's talk about the literary kink scene. Yes, it existed. One of the most famous examples, the Roman de la Rose, a wildly popular 13th century French poem that disguised erotic instruction as a romantic allegory. It was like a medieval mashup of a sex ed book and a fantasy novel, full of flowers, desire, gates, keys, and a not-so-subtle obsession with unlocking pleasure. And that was just the mainstream stuff. Hidden in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, those beautiful hand-painted books, are countless bizarre and bawdy scenes. Monks spanking each other, knights being chased by naked women, human-animal hybrids in compromising positions. It's like the medieval version of drawing something weird in your school notebook, except with gold leaf. Why? Because even scribes got bored, and maybe aroused. But let's get real about actual desires. There were fetishes, power play, voyeurism, exhibitionism. The very same fantasies we think of today existed back then, just filtered through different languages and taboos. For example, flagellation. At first, it started as penance, whipping yourself to feel closer to Christ's suffering. But then, things got complicated. Some people started enjoying it, like really enjoying it. Writings survive from penitents who describe the ritual in almost erotic detail. The sting, the sweat, the feeling of release. And soon, some flagellation practices drifted far from church-approved territory. There are even records of group flagellation that sound less like worship and more like, well, you get the idea, another kink, cross-dressing. We have accounts of women dressing as men to escape convents, yes, but also of men dressing as women for festivals, sometimes as a joke, sometimes not. In places like Venice or Paris, masquerade culture gave people a kind of license to blur gender boundaries and experiment with identity and desire behind masks. Even religious festivals like Carnival turned into massive, chaotic expressions of all the stuff society tried to suppress: lust, indulgence, role reversals, erotic theater. And then there were the love manuals, not just the Kama Sutra. Europe had its own versions, often translated, sometimes smuggled. They were handwritten, copied in secret, and passed around like medieval contraband. Illustrated, annotated, and full of advice like, rub the thighs gently and whisper sweet words before you enter. Yes, that's real. One 15th century German manuscript details dozens of positions, hygiene tips, and even love potions. It might as well be a cosmopolitan article from 1450. Now, let's talk about kinks and class. For the nobles, fantasies were theatrical, elaborate costumes, perfumed chambers, silk restraints. For peasants, kinks were earthy, straw beds, barns, risky rendezvous behind alehouses. There are folk songs passed down orally, filled with bawdy lyrics about millers' daughters, horny monks, and lusty shepherds. These songs weren't just entertainment, they were an escape, a coded way of expressing forbidden thoughts. You want taboo. Incest was a recurring fantasy in medieval literature, not necessarily acted upon, but definitely explored in stories and myths. So was bestiality and threesomes, involving angels or devils. Metaphors, yes, but dripping with repressed imagination. Let's not forget magical kinks. People used charms and spells to attract lovers, increase performance, or, in some cases, hex their enemies' genitals. One popular charm involved writing a lover's name on a piece of bread, stuffing it in a pigeon, and burying it under their doorstep. Not exactly Tinder, but just as desperate. There are trial records where men and women were accused of using love magic to seduce nobles or manipulate their spouses. Some were tortured, others were banished, all of them likely just victims of deeply personal and totally human longing. Then there were the underground brothels that catered not just to lust but to fantasy. Some specialized in roleplay, nobles pretending to be servants, servants pretending to be queens. Some dressed their workers as angels, nuns, even demons. Clients paid extra for scenes that mirrored their fears, their desires, or their sins. And yet, much of this remained hidden because the church loomed large. Its power didn't just control public behavior, it shaped internal guilt. So the kinks, they survived in secret, in stories, in symbols, in spaces where repression became its own kind of fuel. This wasn't a time of innocence. It was a time of intensity, where desire had to wear masks, sneak through shadows, and cling to the margins of culture. But it endured, because imagination is stubborn, and fantasy never obeys. So, next time you think of the medieval world as dry, dusty, and dull, remember the monk who hid erotic drawings in his Bible, the noblewoman who hired a servant to spy on her lover, the peasant who whispered dirty songs under moonlight. They dreamed just like us, sometimes in ways that still feel scandalous today, and sometimes in ways we've only just begun to rediscover. The witch, the midwife, and the sex healer. Power, pleasure, and punishment. You sit by a flickering fire, the scent of rosemary and old ash curling around your nose. Behind you, a woman moans, not in passion, but in pain. She's in labor, her hands gripping the legs of a wooden stool, sweat soaking the fabric of her shift. You whisper to her, not just comfort, instruction, encouragement, power. You reach for the small pouch tied to your belt, full of dried herbs, mugwort, yarrow, fennel. Not magic, just medicine, but to the eyes of frightened men who think all knowledge must come from Latin texts and robed clerics. You might as well be summoning demons, because your hands, your words, your potions, they do what many physicians cannot. They heal, they soothe, they even stir lust back into tired marriages. And in a world where the church clings to control over the body and soul, that makes you dangerous. You are the keeper of intimate secrets, and that's exactly why they want to silence you. Across Europe, especially in rural villages, midwives were the primary source of gynecological knowledge. They knew how to turn a breached baby, how to stop a hemorrhage, how to soothe a lover's limp desire with a brew made from crushed beetles and honey. Was it always effective? No, but sometimes it worked, and even when it didn't, it gave people hope. The church didn't like that, because midwives were often unsupervised, unlicensed. They didn't speak in Latin. They didn't pray before every act. They worked with the body directly and sometimes sensually. Some knew how to make contraceptive salve herbs like pennyroyal, silphium, or rue, boiled into oil and applied where priests dared not look. Others whispered about moon charms and the power of the blood, ancient rituals connecting women to cycles far older than scripture. Midwives weren't just nurses. They were sex educators, relationship counselors, fertility guides, abortion providers, and death doulas. And when things went wrong, when a child died, or a man's desire shriveled, or a noblewoman miscarried, the whispers began. Witch, whore, demon wife. But let's not forget the erotic power at play here. Some women who worked in this world weren't just healers. They were set not in the scandalous way the church imagined, but in the sensual, deeply human way of someone who understood pleasure as healing. There were traveling women who offered potions for passion, who spoke of Venus as a goddess, not a sin, who read from half-burned Roman scrolls about how to bring a man to climax and how to control it. Some even claimed to sell spells that would ensure loyalty or make your partner only desire you. Foolish, maybe, but in a world where marriage was often arranged and love was rare, the promise of enchantment was a rare luxury. And what about the men? There were male, cunning folk-too healers, astrologers, potion makers. Some of them offered similar services: love elixirs, virility tonics, aphrodisiac, honey cakes, but they were rarely burned for it because they weren't touching the womb, or challenging male authority, or helping women take control of their own bodies. That was the real threat. Let's fast forward to the rise of witch trials. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, thousands of women were tried and executed for witchcraft. And no, most of them weren't casting spells or flying on broomsticks. They were midwives, widows, herbalists, sex workers, survivors. They were women who had too much knowledge, or no husband, or too many lovers, or none at all. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written in 1487, specifically warned that witches were lustful by nature and worked through carnal pleasure. It described in grotesque detail how witches seduced men, stole penises, or made men impotent through sorcery. And that tells you something. Even in their fears, they fixated on sex. Because when women had sexual autonomy, or worse, could teach it, they became uncontrollable. And patriarchal systems hate what they can't control. Let's shift back to the village. You're grinding herbs in a wooden bowl. The door creaks open, and a young man stands there, eyes flicking nervously. He says his wife hasn't touched him in months, that something feels lost between them. You don't ask if he's cheated, or if he smells of ale and sweat and disappointment. You simply nod and hand him a satchel with instructions. Boil it, breathe it, whisper her name into the steam. Does it work? Maybe. But maybe it doesn't have to. Because what you've done is this: given him intention, a ritual, a story. And maybe in performing it, he will remember what it means to desire with tenderness. This is your power. It's not about magic. It's about memory, emotion, connection. But the bishop would never understand that. When the torches come, they don't ask questions. They tie your hands. They say you slept with Satan, that you seduced married men with herbal baths, that you whispered Latin backwards while rubbing goose fat on a woman's thighs. You try to explain that it was for childbirth, that you only used what nature gave, that you never summoned a demon, only peace. They laugh, because they're not here for truth, they're here for control. So what's the legacy? Even centuries later, echoes remain. We still whisper about natural medicine with suspicion, still debate sex education, still shame women who understand their own bodies, still fear pleasure that isn't licensed by religion or law. But here's the twist: the knowledge survived in hidden manuscripts, in folk songs, in family recipes, passed down like sacred scripture, in stories like this one, because the witches, midwives, and sex healers weren't just victims, they were rebels, they were protectors of pleasure, and they refused to be erased. Forbidden love, secret affairs. You think love in the Middle Ages was all knights and damsels, courtly sonnets and stolen glances. Think again, because behind the veils of religious morality and arranged marriages, there were lovers whose desires didn't fit into the scripts written by monks and monarchs. Men who loved men, women who craved other women, people who defied the strict categories of male and female long before we had the language to describe it. Their stories were hidden, punished, or buried under layers of allegory, but they existed in abbey letters, in poetry scrawled in the margins of Bibles, in trial records meant to shame but now accidentally illuminate. You just have to know where to look. Let's start with the monasteries. Ironically, the very places built to repress the flesh often became spaces where forbidden desire could breathe, quietly, dangerously, sometimes tenderly. Men and women, cut off from the opposite sex, found solace in each other. Friendships deepened, affection blurred, and sometimes those bonds turned physical. In one 12th century monastery, a scribe carefully copied a text known as the Carmina Burana, a raucous, sensual collection of poems. Among its pages, explicit love songs between men, written in Latin, hidden between hymns. One poem reads, "I burn for the beauty of your thighs, though I fear the bishop's eyes." That line says everything. And what about women? Nuns, yes, even the ones later canonized, wrote to each other with striking intensity. Hildegard of Bingen, now considered a saint and visionary, described her closest female companion as her mirror of the soul and her beloved in the Lord. Were they lovers? We can't say for sure, but we do know this. Some convents had reputations for being emotionally and sometimes physically intimate spaces between women. In fact, in some parts of Europe, female same-sex relationships were tolerated more than male ones, not because they were accepted, but because the male authorities simply refused to believe they involved real sex. Which is hilarious, if you think about it. Ignorance made a closet. Now, let's talk about gender. Yes, even in the 13th century, people lived outside the gender binary. Take Eleanor Reichener, a Londoner arrested in 1394 for working as a sex worker while presenting as a woman, though assigned male at birth. In court documents, she described having relations with both men and women, including priests and noblemen. Was Eleanor trans, a drag performer, a gender non-conforming worker, surviving in a brutal system? We don't know how Eleanor would have defined themselves, but we do know this: their identity wasn't just tolerated, it was sought out, desired, feared, and that fear, not the act, was the real sin in the church's eyes. In aristocratic courts, same-sex love appeared in poems and coded letters. Take Richard the Lionheart, king, crusader, and frequent bedmate of Philip II of France. Was it diplomacy? Was it love? Was it both? Meanwhile, in medieval Arabic and Persian texts, far more open than their European counterparts, poets wrote openly about the beauty of boys, the ache of forbidden love, and the fluidity of identity. These works were sometimes shared and translated in Southern Europe, especially in Al-Andalus, where intellectual freedom burned brighter than anywhere north of the Pyrenees. Of course, not all stories ended well. Many were crushed, quite literally, under torture and fire. Accusations of sodomy weren't just moral charges, they were weapons, used to eliminate rivals, punish dissent, or target outsiders. But just like the witches and midwives, the queer lovers found ways to survive. They used code words, shared rings, wrote initials in corners of love songs, hid their feelings inside friendship poems, and in doing so, they left us a map. So let's honor that map. Let's remember that queer history isn't new. It's just been erased, burned, or laughed off as close friendship. Let's tell the story of the knight who loved his squire, the nun who kissed her sister goodnight a little longer than necessary, the peasant who danced in both men's and women's clothes under the carnival moon, and the healer, the lover, the dreamer, who defied a world that said their heart was unnatural, because it wasn't. It was human. The brothel, the bard, and the secret history of medieval pornography. So, you think pornography is a modern invention? Scroll back a few centuries. Now imagine a world where ink-stained monks copy scripture by day and doodle naked acrobats in the margins by candlelight, where traveling bards sing heroic ballads and then slip into taverns after dark to recite scandalous verses that would make even your dirtiest group chat blush. Yeah, welcome to the unfiltered, uncensored, and highly underappreciated world of medieval erotica. Let's walk into the brothel, not with judgment, but with curiosity. You might be surprised by what you find. First, let's talk about the brothels. They weren't all shadowy alley dens. Some were fully licensed, tax-paying establishments. In cities like London, Paris, certain districts were set aside for regulated pleasure. Officials would even inspect them, not to shut them down, but to keep them efficient. Inside, painted walls, clean beds, perfumed sheets, women trained not just in sex, but in flirtation, fashion, storytelling. Some brothels had themes: Roman goddesses, woodland fantasies, or even religious roleplay. Yes, someone in 1340 probably paid extra to be punished by a nun. And guess who visited? Everyone. Nobles, merchants, friars. It wasn't just for pleasure. It was for politics, secrets, and occasionally even spy work. Now, let's bring in the bard. Not every medieval poet wore tights and recited love sonnets beneath castle windows. Some composed what scholars now call Goliardic verse, satirical, irreverent, and frequently filthy. These poems talked about drinking, gambling, and sex, often in hilarious, grotesque detail. A favorite example: one verse describes a monk who leaves his monastery to explore the sins of the flesh, only to be outperformed by a farmer's daughter who charges by the hour and knows 22 positions and a potion recipe. It was smut, but make it clever, and it was recited in public squares, sung in taverns, even scribbled onto church pews. Let's not forget visual art. You've probably seen those beautiful illuminated manuscripts, gold edges, careful lettering, religious imagery. But in the margins, that's where the fun happens. Tiny illustrations of people fornicating, rabbits spanking monks, a nun plucking fruit from a very phallic-looking tree. Historians used to dismiss them as jokes. But what if they were expressions, hidden kinks, tiny rebellions etched in sacred books? Porn didn't need a screen. It needed a brush, a smirk, and a place to hide. Even playing cards got naughty. In late 15th century Germany, an anonymous artist created a deck where the suits included lovers, positions, and frankly, NSFW symbolism. It wasn't mass-produced. It wasn't for gambling. It was personal entertainment. We're talking about softcore medieval smut, hand-painted on parchment, for nobles who wanted something stimulating before bed. But perhaps the most overlooked aspect of medieval erotica: consent and pleasure, especially for women. Some love guides explicitly describe how to please a partner. They advise foreplay, emotional trust, touching with respect. Not exactly what you'd expect from a society we often paint as brutish and patriarchal, huh? Now, sure, not everything was rosy. There were deeply misogynistic and violent depictions too. But that's why this history matters. It reminds us that sex, and the way we represent it, is always cultural, always political, and always evolving. So, here's your takeaway. The Middle Ages weren't prudish, they were complicated. They had rules, yes, but they also had loopholes, shadow spaces, margins where people doodled what they really wanted, sang what they couldn't say in church, hid what they felt, but never stopped feeling. Medieval pornography existed, and it was creative, poetic, sometimes hilarious, sometimes tender, and always, always human. Power is sexy, and in the medieval world, it was everything. Not just armies and titles, but whispers in bedchambers, glances across court banquets, and letters sealed with lips instead of wax. Because behind every king's decree and queen's gown was a tangled web of seduction, strategy, and scandal. You think modern politics gets messy. You, Haven Tea, seen a royal mistress poison a rival with almond cakes while dictating policy from her lover Eslap. Welcome to the erotic court, where sex wasn't just recreation, it was negotiation, and no one played the game better than the courtesans. Forget the damsels in distress trope. The real power players wore silk, read Latin, and knew exactly how to get a nobleman's attention and keep it. Courtesans weren't common prostitutes. They were trained in poetry, conversation, music, and yes, the art of pleasure. They dined with diplomats, advised monarchs, changed wars. They were both lover and confidant. Take Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France. She didn't just share his bed, she helped him govern. She picked his ministers. She even pushed him to retake Normandy. and she wore dresses with necklines so low the church had a panic attack. Or Veronica Franco of Venice, poet, writer, seductress. She was educated, articulate, and unafraid. When accused of witchcraft, she defended herself so skillfully in court. She was acquitted and admired. She didn't just survive, she thrived. But this wasn't just about women wielding power. It was about power seducing itself. Kings used sex to control alliances. Queens used marriage beds to hide affairs or forge secret bonds. One English monarch had at least 4 official mistresses and a dozen unofficial ones. But he also used his lovers to gather intel. They'd pillow talk secrets out of visiting nobles, then pass those tidbits to the crown. Espionage meets intimacy. Meanwhile, queens were no saints either. Isabella of France, the she-wolf of England, likely helped murder her husband with the aid of her lover. Catherine de' Medici kept erotic art in her chambers and was rumored to employ a team of beautiful spies, women trained to seduce and report. They called them the Flying Squadron. You can't make this up. Royal marriages weren't about love, they were chess moves. But what happened when love or lust refused to stay out of it? Henry VIII split the church in 2 to marry Anne Boleyn. But before she was queen, she was a courtesan of the highest order, trained in the French court, schooled in charm, and utterly captivating. She refused to be just another mistress. She demanded a crown and got it, along with a tragic end. But her influence reshaped England forever. Sex was weaponized in other ways, too. If you wanted to ruin someone's reputation, accuse them of adultery, incest, or worse. The church had ears everywhere, and a whisper of moral failure could end a career faster than any sword. It didn't matter if it was true. Accusation equals damnation. One noblewoman was accused of sleeping with a demon just because she refused a duke's advances. Another man was exiled after rumors spread that he performed unnatural acts with a rival's wife. Justice, rare. Jealousy, constant. But not all royal passion was toxic. Some love affairs were real, deep, emotional, and enduring. King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville had a secret, passionate courtship. She was a commoner, a widow, and politically inconvenient, but he married her anyway. They exchanged heartfelt letters, stood together during war, and, against all odds, built a dynasty. Their union was scandalous, but also kind of romantic. And it proved one thing: even in a world obsessed with power, sometimes love still managed to sneak in. So what can we learn from all this? That sex and power were never separate. In medieval courts, desire shaped history. Mistresses became ministers. Lovers became spies. Bedchambers became battlegrounds. It wasn't just who slept with whom. It was who used it best. You kneel before the carved wooden screen. On the other side, silence, then a cough, a creak, the faint scent of incense and sweat, and finally, a voice. Confess your sins, my child. You hesitate, not because you re-guilty, but because you know the man behind that screen has scenes of his own, maybe darker, maybe dirtier, maybe not even hidden. Because in the shadows of medieval churches, not every priest was holy, and not every confession was sacred. Let us talk about the clergy, and how they were often the worst at following their own rules. The medieval church preached chastity, celibacy, piety. They scolded peasants for lust, punished women for temptation, and held up virginity like it was the only form of virtue that counted. But here, The twist. Many of the same men shouting from the pulpit were sneaking into beds at night. Some had mistresses, others had multiple. There are records of bishops with secret families, wives they never officially married, children baptized quietly, scandals hushed up with bribes or threats. One French cardinal kept a house filled with courtesans. Another was accused of fathering 70 children. 70. Let that number settle in. And confession, it wasn't always a safe space. Sure, the idea was beautiful, a private place to unburden your soul, speak your darkest thoughts, and receive forgiveness. But in practice, some priests used confessions to gather gossip. Others used it to control people, especially women. There are documented cases where priests gave penance that was less about God and more about getting favors. Come to my quarters, and I'll forgive your sin. Show me where he touched you. Tell me everything, slowly. It wasn't just abuse, it was spiritual blackmail. But the hypocrisy went deeper. There were monks who wrote erotic poetry under pen names, friars who visited brothels in disguise, nuns who hid letters from lovers in the folds of their habits, or met them under moonlight in cloistered gardens. One abbess was caught running what was essentially a noble women-only escort service. Another monastery in Spain became infamous for wild parties that made Roman orgies look tame, and yet they kept preaching purity. Here's a particularly twisted chapter. The Inquisition. Originally meant to root out heresy, it quickly turned into a machine for moral control, and sex was always suspect. Women who were too outspoken, too beautiful, too free, accused of witchcraft. Men who defied the Church's teachings on sex, tortured until they confessed to unnatural acts. People caught reading forbidden books about love or anatomy, arrested for lustful curiosity. One woman in Germany was burned at the stake because she danced naked in a field and claimed it freed her soul. Another man was executed for teaching villagers how to make a contraceptive potion from parsley and honey. Knowledge was dangerous, pleasure worse. And yet, even in this climate, desire refused to die. Some priests wrote secret manuals, not to denounce sex, but to explain it. Their S1 14th century guide, written by a friar, that explains how to pleasure a woman without bringing shame to the soul. Another offers tips for spiritual intimacy between married couples, complete with diagrams. These texts were hidden, copied in secret, shared with those who dared to ask questions, because deep down, even some clergy knew the body was not the enemy. Only control was. But let's go darker. There are confessional records, real ones, that read like erotic horror stories. Women confessing lustful dreams about angels. Men begging forgiveness for sleeping with statues of the Virgin Mary. Entire villages convinced they were cursed because of nocturnal emissions. Guilt wasn't just spiritual, it was weaponized. Some believed that every sexual act outside of marriage condemned your soul 2 years, centuries, in purgatory. Others were told that touching yourself summoned demons. One monk claimed that masturbation opened a gate for the devil to enter through the loins. Try enjoying your body after that sermon. And yet, people rebelled in quiet ways. They made love in secret, shared recipes for moon tea to prevent pregnancy, sang dirty songs after Mass, drew erotic graffiti on the back walls of churches. Desire always finds a way. even when the church builds a wall. So what does this all mean? That the medieval church wasn't a monolith of purity. It was a labyrinth of contradictions, some deeply devout, others deeply corrupt. A place where some truly sought salvation and others just sought power. And in the middle of it all, ordinary people trying to love, to feel, to forgive themselves for being human. So next time you hear someone say, sex in the Middle Ages didn't exist, remind them, it existed. It just had to wear a robe and whisper. The death of shame, plague, lust, and the final orgy of the Middle Ages, the bells rang again. But this time, no one moved. No doors slammed shut. No villagers whispered. They were all either dead or trying not to be. The year is 1348, and Europe is rotting. The Black Death sweeps across the continent like a biblical curse. 1 out of every 3 people gone. And when death is everywhere, in your home, in your breath, in the faces of your children, something inside you snaps. You stop fearing hell. You stop fearing judgment. You stop fearing anything except missing the chance to feel alive. This was the moment when shame died. People began to live like every kiss was their last, because it might be. Clergy stopped enforcing purity laws. Monks broke their vows. Nuns took lovers. Prostitutes made fortunes. And the dividing lines between sin and survival blurred into oblivion. Mass graves filled faster than priests could bless them. So people stopped caring if they died in grace and started caring about dying with a little pleasure still on their lips. In some cities, chaos turned into carnality. Witnesses wrote about death orgies, parties where the wine never stopped and neither did the moaning. People danced naked in cemeteries. They kissed strangers in the street. They confessed sins only to commit more in the same breath. A bishop in Avignon wrote, "Men who never touched a woman now cry out for one. Chaste wives throw off their veils. It is as if death has broken every chain. Was it sin or was it freedom? Does it matter when tomorrow isn't promised?" Let's talk about the plague doctors. You know the ones. Black cloaks, glass goggles, bird masks stuffed with herbs. They looked like death itself. But beneath the beaked facade, men, often underpaid, exhausted, and terrified. Many took comfort where they could, some in prayer, others in brothels, others still in the arms of grieving widows who simply didn't want to die alone. There are letters from these doctors, filled with lust, loneliness, and unspoken guilt. One wrote, "I heal bodies, but none heal mine. I walk through moans, both of death and pleasure." And what about the church? Overwhelmed, powerless, terrified. They couldn't explain the plague, couldn't stop it. So some turned fanatical, others turned silent. Meanwhile, underground groups formed strange sects, heretical cults, where sex became ritual. Some whipped themselves in public as penance. Others did the opposite, indulged every craving, believing that pleasure was the last true prayer. In Germany, a cult of dancers claimed sex was the only cure, that orgasms could purge the soul of sickness. In France, a woman claimed she spoke to angels while making love, and her followers believed her enough to strip down and join her. Desperation rewrites morality. Art changed to paintings that once glorified saints now showed decaying bodies. Skeletons dancing with brides, angels vomiting blood. But even in death, lust clung on. Women with parted lips, Men clutching at naked flesh, saints collapsing in ecstatic poses that looked more like climax than rapture. Because when death draws near, the body becomes both terrifying and sacred. And yet, through all the darkness, there was tenderness. Lovers holding hands as they coughed their last breath. Letters written in trembling ink. If I die tonight, know that I dreamed of your skin until the end. Parents choosing to die beside their sick children, refusing to flee. Strangers kissing in alleyways just to feel human. Not every act was lust. Some were resistance, rebellion, reminders that the soul is more than fear. So what was the final orgy of the Middle Ages? It wasn't just sex. It was the collapse of a system, one that tried to control bodies, shame, desire, and punish pleasure. It was people reclaiming their lives, not with swords, but with touch, with longing, with reckless, defiant love. It was the sound of moaning behind monastery walls, the scent of wine and sweat in city streets, the heat of two hands finding each other in a world turned cold. And when the plague finally passed, so did the spell. The church tried to reassert order. Shame crept back in. Rules were rewritten. Bodies were once again wrapped in guilt. But not everyone forgot. Some remembered how it felt to live like every breath mattered, to love like judgment was just another dead idea. And that memory, that flicker of freedom, it survived. But now, here we are, at the end of our little journey through the shadowy, sensual corridors of medieval desire. You made it, alive, a little disturbed, maybe, possibly turned on. No judgment. What started with chaste veils and candlelit prayers led us through forbidden manuscripts, scandalous rituals, and some very questionable uses of bread and pigeons. If the church tried to silence it, someone whispered it in the dark. If the nobles tried to cover it with silk and shame, someone wrote it in a song. If the world said no, the body still said yes. Because here's the truth, buried in all the dust and doctrine, behind all the guilt and gilded icons, people never stopped wanting, and they never stopped imagining. And maybe, just maybe, they were a little more like us than we comfortable admitting. If this twisted tale of medieval passion made you raise your eyebrows or your heart rate, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps more than you think. Tell me in the comments, what was the weirdest, wildest, or most WTF part for you? Subscribe to the channel if you want more scandalous, sexy, and strange slices of history that never make it into school textbooks. And if you're brave enough to come back for more, I'll be here. Candles lit, curtains drawn. Because history isn't just battles and kings. Sometimes it's what they did after dark. Thanks for watching.